welcome to the LitChix podcast. We are Mary Ellen Humphrey, and I'm Susan Landrigan, and we're coming to you from the Innovation Studio at Lakeshore Center for the Arts in Westfield, New York. Today, we're going to discuss how to critique someone's work. And at our writers group, we do that a lot.
We do. In fact, that's, I think, one of the primary purposes and usefulness of a writers group is to get feedback on what you're working on. And feedback or critiquing, it can sometimes feel a little daunting from both perspectives, from the idea of the person who wrote the words to the person who has to give feedback on it. So I know you've had some experience now being in the writers group.
Yes, and it's almost terrifying having to read your work out loud.
Well,
But because it's your baby.
Yes.
You made all this, and somebody's going to rip it apart. But they don't. They're very kind in our writers group.
well, here's perhaps something that can help dealing with that, because it's, you put your heart on your sleeve, right? Our words are our babies. However, when you're looking at being in a critiquing situation, it isn't about the person, it's about the words. So if you can view this as, these are the words that I wrote them, but the critique is about them, not me personally. And if you're in the process of providing that feedback, also remember, it's not about the person. It's about the words and what you're looking for in giving feedback to the person who wrote the words, so they can make it better. Or if it's great, maybe they don't need to do too much to it. It's always helpful to figure out, first of all, what the author of the words is looking for. So if you have someone, we have a person who's coming in with the first draft of a story, and I think that person really is looking for, is the story working? When you're writing something down for people to read, you've got in your mind what you see, and then they read it and they see what is in their mind. So the question really is, do those words effectively convey the intention that you have as a writer? And so that, looking at it from that perspective, makes it a little less personal, a little more professional about the work that's being done. So there are different kinds of critiquing. There's this general overview critiquing, which is where, like, if you're writing a novel, you might want to know, is this realistic? Does the plot keep your interest? Are my descriptions over the top, or do they need more? What's missing? And that kind of thing. So that's more of an overview. It's a simple review of the story, and it covers things like dislikes about the story. I didn't like the way this character did this. It seemed out of character. Could be a critique. Maybe the dialogue doesn't match, or one of the most common things is everybody talks the same. And as you're writing this, you may not notice that you're doing that. So So you have to go back in and say, well, this character has a little bit of this kind of talking way, and this person is different, so their words are going to be a little different. And so those kind of things are very helpful to hear in a writing group. Now, you mentioned that you read your work to the writers group and then you get feedback.
Right.
And that's one way of doing it. But there are several ways to do critiquing. And one that's very common is to provide the work in advance in a written format. And nowadays you can email, so people don't have to use paper for everything. And so people have this piece before you read it. And you may not even need to read it, but I think reading out loud really helps not only the person who wrote it, but the person who's critiquing it, because you're now hearing a different venue of those words.
I've had my work done both ways, both over email and reading it out loud to the group, and I find that I get better feedback when I read it to the group.
Okay.
I get better suggestions.
Yep.
And when I do it over the email, I just get grammatical errors, which is fine. I need that too.
Yeah, well, that's another form of critiquing, which is generally more towards the end when the piece is almost ready to be published or go public. You want to have this kind of line editing where you're looking for all the syntax and mistakes and commas and all that kind of stuff. But so
some of the things that have been very helpful for me are like when somebody says, well, this is an awkward sentence, so you need to rework that sentence. Or maybe the paragraph isn't working. Or,
Right.
or who is this person who suddenly showed up?
Wait, we need a hint.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think, as I said, when we write, we don't realize what we're leaving out or if we're adding too
Right.
much. We assume the reader knows what we know. And in some cases, they do. I mean, especially if you're trying to describe, let's say you wanted to describe this building, and you're writing something for local people. You don't have to go into all the details that you might if somebody wasn't from Westfield and was looking at this building. So there's a judgment you have to make as a writer about how much to include in your piece.
Right.
What we do in our group, we do tend to read it out loud, which I think serves a number of purposes. It helps the critiquer because we're getting a second shot at it if we've read it quietly to ourselves, but it also helps the writer, don't you think? Because you hear it. In fact, you can even do that on your own without an audience.
When you're writing, you're not often reading out loud. So when you do read aloud, you see your mistakes more than if you're just reading it silently to yourself.
You do.
Those things you just overlook when you're reading it to yourself. So it is helpful.
There is a thing on the if you're using Word that will read your work to you. It's kind of a monotone computer voice, but I've done that before just to sort of sit there and listen to it, and I do hear things that I don't see when I read it myself. So you can, even if you're alone, you can do that, but you don't have to have anybody there. I've got 4 in my audience. They're little kitties and they'll listen to me all day long, so I could read them a story, and it's just the idea that there's another method of the words coming back to you. And another thing that you can do if you're editing is you can go backwards. You can start at the bottom, read a paragraph, and then the next paragraph, and you get a very different perspective on what you've done.
Oh, I've never thought of doing it that way.
That's an interesting thing to do, especially when you're doing some final editing of a book or something, and going backwards. It's also helpful, I'll say this, if you have a book manuscript that you've got edits in and you've got a whole bunch of changes to make, start from the back and work to the front. And here's why. If you're trying to find those pages that you've made notes on, but you've changed the ones before it, all the page numbers are wrong. So if you go backwards, you constantly have the correct pages when you're correcting it. It's a little tip, but it makes a huge difference when you're trying to correct a big manuscript.
Well, you usually start at the beginning. Well, this is what I've done many times. I start at the beginning, and then, I don't have time to finish it. I'll come back to it later. And the next time you start at the beginning again. And then, So the end doesn't get as much editing for me as the beginning does. And so that's a good, I like that idea.
It is. I discovered it by accident because I was I was editing a whole book that was written. It was a final edit with several friends who would help me, which is what I kind of call poor man's proofing. But as I started doing it, I realized all the pages are going to be wrong. So I started from the back, and it does give you a different perspective as well. So as you're going backwards through the story, by the time you get done, it's all still in the right order. But then you have to go back through and make sure your chapters and things are, not half a page down and all that sort of stuff. But it is interesting how that happens. Something that I really like to emphasize to folks is don't overdo it. When you are critiquing somebody's work, first say what you like about it. Find something, even if you didn't like it much at all, find something. The person used words in a way that you hadn't seen before, and it was really unique and interesting. Or a sentence struck you as being particularly well crafted. Find something that you like first. Because, you got to be sensitive to the person, and you want them to accept what you're going to say that isn't positive. So it's easier to accept something if you've had a cushion first. And then pick 1 or 2 things at most to say. Don't tear it apart and say 10 things. Find something that really sticks out to you. And if you're in a group, find something different from what others have already said. So that it's more helpful. And then when the person's getting this feedback, they're going to be able to take it and listen and assimilate it better. So that's a pretty, it isn't a written rule, but it's a good thing to do. if you're critiquing.
And I think one of the things I always ask when we're doing that at Writers Group is, did you find that at all interesting, or is it just boring? And most of the people have said, well, yes, I find that interesting. So that's what I want to know, is this worth pursuing farther?
That is a really good point, Susan, because you should ask for what you want. And if you're like I said, if you're writing a first draft, you may say, I want to know, does this story catch your attention? Does it make sense? Do you like the characters? Generally speaking, if you were reading this, would you pick this amount? Would you finish the story? That might be what you want, that kind of feedback. Or you might say, I've written the story, I've revised it 4 times, I think it's getting where I want it, tell me if it works and what's wrong now. And somebody might say, well, your opening line really doesn't capture the whole story. You might be able to write it better this way. And so you're looking for more specific, more zeroed-in feedback at that stage. And then at the end, it's been written, we've rehashed it, it's revised again, it's done. Now I want a copy edit. Can you folks tell me, do you see any mistakes? Like, I spelled the wrong word here. It's this word, but it's the wrong word, or which is very common.
Yeah, with auto-check, yeah.
It doesn't show up in auto-check. And I can't tell you how many times in a writer's group, one person will pick that up. And it may be a different person for a different word, but there's, like lesson and lesson. I've lessened the burden, or I've taken a course, a lesson. And they're spelled differently, but spell check isn't going to get that.
Right.
And one person will, but you don't want it to be a reader after it's published.
Right.
Right? So those are the kind of final edits and critiques that you want. I like to think of a word that really makes it a little more easy and palatable is workshopping. So when I was teaching writing at the college level, I would always say, we're going to workshop our pieces today. And we would pair up 2 or 3 people in a group, and we would take whatever we had written, and we'd feedback towards each other. The same thing as critiquing, but calling it workshopping. So that we're working on it. It's a work in progress, and we're helping you to make it better. So that's another way to look at critiquing. So let me ask you this. Were you in a writer's group before?
No.
So this is your first experience, and it's been a couple years now, right?
Yes.
And are you happy you joined? Do you like it?
I am happy, and I do like it. Very scary at first, because you're putting yourself out there. But I've gotten more comfortable with it.
Yes.
I do, when I'm reading part of my memoirs, I do have a hard time with that because it's emotional.
Personal, yeah. Yeah, that is true. I actually have some books that I've written that if I read them, I cry. So I don't know what my readers do. Maybe they cry. But it is true. I also want to say, Susan, that there are other benefits to a writer's group. Critiquing is the central pillar. But you also form friendships with other writers where you can become comfortable sharing your work. You also learn to share publicly if you haven't done public speaking. It can be very scary even in a class. I remember when I was young and in class I couldn't read my own work because I would just faint. I'd turn red and then I'd turn white. Everybody's watching me like, oh, she's going to fall over. So those things come with practice. And so you get a little stronger, you get a little more confident. And
I'm better at reading somebody else's work than I am my own.
And sometimes we do that. We have someone else read what we wrote, which is also interesting because now you're hearing someone read your work, and you're the one listening to it, which is interesting by itself. There was another point.
I think we're about out of time.
Are we? Oh
yes.
My gosh! Did that go by fast?
It did. Well, thank you for spending time with us today. We value your feedback, and we'll see you next week.
We didn't do our